Again, are people entering the webinar?
Yes, they are. We have 85 participants so far.
Amazing.
Begin.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll give it a couple more minutes for people to trickle in, and then we will begin. Good evening to those of you just joining us. We're just going to give it one more minute, and then we will begin. All right. So good evening, everyone. My name is Michaela Yanni, and I am the Communications Specialist at Island Stress Conservancy. I want to thank you for attending this webinar to learn about the devastating impact of invasive species on island ecosystems and how you can help. Before we begin, I would like to pass on our gratitude to Elder Robert George, a Cowichan Tribes member who was going to welcome us today, but is now unfortunately unable to attend this evening. So in lieu of Robert, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. I'm grateful to live on such abundant lands, rich in diversity and beauty. So before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. Only the presenters will be able to speak today, but if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and passing on those questions when we get to our Q&A session. And this webinar will be recorded and will be available on our stewardship education webpage as soon as possible. We are hoping to finish promptly at 8:30 this evening, and we may even end early, so we will get started right away. So our first presenter is Kyle Clark, an education coordinator and native plant gardening expert and enthusiast. So thank you, Kyle. I'll pass it over to you and share my screen to get your presentation started. All right, over to you, Kyle.
All righty. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about invasive species removal and native plant restoration and gardening. First, I would like to mention and recognize where I'm speaking from. I'm speaking from Jotlip or Sartlip, which is the place of maples, and I recognize that I get to work here and I appreciate all that I get to do out here on these lands, and I always make sure to focus and recenter my mindset to focus my work on supporting and revitalizing the native ecosystems and the language of this area. This is a map of the whole Saanich territory made by Dave Elliott in the Saltwater Peoples Atlas. And I encourage you to go look at it and see where you're from as well. Aitanen Niswaika. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kyle. I like plants, bugs, and space, and I work in the field of plants and bugs mostly, but I'm happy to talk about space as well. My entire professional career, I've been working with restoring and revitalizing native plants, and recently I've started working in the aspect of youth education and working with kids, bridging that gap of understanding. I work at a nonprofit out here in Ojotlip called Pagan Hayout, and what we do is we provide native plant education to youth, mainly at the Kleonu Tribal School. We provide workshops which is what I'm doing in this picture, teaching the students about the plants from their homelands and how they can learn to understand the relationships that exist and how they can uphold and promote the land around them so that they and the plants can thrive in the future. Um, I've done, in terms of native plant gardening, um, I've created a native plant garden on Silex territory, and I've also in the process of making a native plant garden here in Jotlip as our native plant garden for teaching is moving. So I guess the $1 million question, what is an invasive species? An invasive species is a species that is not from its native range and it causes harm to the environment and the ecosystem around it. So, a common misconception is all non native species are invasive species, which isn't true. Um, a lot of non native species don't have invasive tendencies, and the invasive tendencies are where the destruction and the environmental impacts lie. Invasive species are it's a term for the harmful plants and animals that are out of their native range, but basically they have been introduced into an ecosystem that has co-evolved for millions of years, creating very diverse connections and interactions with all of the plants and animals around them. And these species often come in and they're able to grow or exist without any known predators or limitations. A good example of this is the Scotch broom. Scotch broom has been brought onto the island, and in its native range over in Europe, it is within that ecosystem and it's managed by the other animals and plants in that ecosystem that are able to keep it at a normal and manageable level. But over here, there's no real predators to Scotch broom and its ability to grow more aggressively than the animals and plants that are seeing other impacts like vegetation consumption by animals and also different diseases and things. So the Scotch broom is able to take over entire places and create a monoculture, which prevents many species from being able to survive. There's many species in the world or in any native ecosystem that have co-evolved with even a single specific plant. An example for that is the ocean spray and a few moths, mostly the Lorquin's admiral, and they grow and support each other. The butterflies pollinate the ocean spray, and the ocean spray provides food for the Lorquin's admiral. And without either of those, neither of those species would exist. And then I'll also mention that people often say to me, ecosystems will sort themselves out. Sure, that may be the case in a million years. But currently, we're in a climate crisis, and some argue the sixth mass extinction. And so, sure, in a million years, the world will bounce back. It's a resilient world, but a lot of harm and destruction will occur in our lifetime, and especially in our future children and grandchildren's lifetime. And you'll see a lot of species decline. I think a lot of people think like, oh, the asteroid came in, extinction, it all happened in a day, but no, it happened over thousands or tens of thousands of years. And so this is the extinction that we're seeing today is at a similar rate to those in the past. And just because we only exist here in a finite amount of time doesn't mean that these species can survive in the way that they are having to deal with right now. And then a lot of people that I talk to get, I guess they get a bit worried or scared that they don't want to do more harm than good when they want to remove invasive species or help the climate. And what I can say is there is a lot of places in all communities, especially in Victoria where I'm living, that have people that are willing to share their knowledge and share their understanding, and then you can take that knowledge, bring it back to where you are living. Now I'll talk about native ecosystems. Native ecosystems are way better than invasive ones. I talked about how their invasive species often create a monoculture, whereas native ecosystems, by growing and evolving over millennia, um, they've created these very specific and diverse connections, and those diverse connections also create a more resilient and strong ecosystem. I liken it when I'm speaking to the kids, as in if you were allergic to peanuts and you were the only person and there was 100,000 of you and a peanut came along, it would wipe out the entire population. Whereas if I was allergic to peanuts in a diverse ecosystem with a whole bunch of different people, as we are today, the peanuts would kill me, but they wouldn't kill the entire population, and the human race would live on. And so it's a similar way. There's these intricate connections that have taken a long time to be created. And when something like an invasive species comes in and destroys those connections, that leaves the climate more and the area more susceptible to impacts like climate change, like change in temperature, change in rainfall, and all those sort of things. And then another thing I'll mention is the plants, especially in the area that I live, but across the world, are culturally significant to people that have lived here for thousands of years before I have. And the knowledge and the culture often lives within these plants and animals. And without them, that culture is lost, especially in cultures that primarily use oral knowledge transfer. Um, these plants and animals are their kin, and without them, the knowledge is lost. There's an example. We work at a place near me called Sneaquith or Todd Inlet, and Sneaquith is named after the blue grouse that lived there for years and years, thousands of years. And the blue grouse has been extirpated from the area. So without knowing that name and without that animal there, that information is lost. We can go to the next slide. So we want to restore and protect the native ecosystems because we are dealing with climate change and want to support the revitalization of native and cultural ecosystems. The best way to do it is to start by finding out about a volunteer group or maybe a few friends, and you join a volunteer group and you learn from there. Um, I started learning about invasive species removal and native plant growth by volunteering with Habitat Acquisition Trust. They're very friendly and kind and welcoming. Um, and then just using that knowledge to support the native plants and animals around the place you live. Maybe you own a property, or maybe you live near a park, and there's ways that you can support those plants and animals as well. I would refrain from pulling out invasive species at random parks without a group, just so that if you don't have all the knowledge or you're not familiar with all of the species there, that you're not causing more harm than good. And the thing that I like doing the most to promote the environment is to grow native species around me. We can go on to the next slide. back one. Giving away the surprise. Growing native plants. Growing native plants is always better than growing non-native plants. Because those plants not only support you, but they support the many animals and other plants that are around you. So there's, especially in Victoria, there's often a lot of easy replacements for plants that you already love to grow. Like there's a native strawberry, there are native raspberries, there are plants that, like the red flowering currant, that provide beautiful pink flowers for the hummingbirds. And these native plants, they they grow here so they can provide a space for those plants and animals that have been displaced through urbanization and stuff like that. I find the best way to learn what native plants will do best where you live is by just looking around and taking the time to understand which native plants are already growing near you. That's how we do a lot of our restoration, is we take our time to look and listen to the land and see what is growing and what used to grow there, so that we know it's already adapted to that space. The main thing I would say is don't harvest these native plants on public lands by yourself. Um, Especially here in Victoria, these native ecosystems are quite degraded and quite sparse. And like I said before, they're culturally important plants, and they're um, people from this place, Husainich people and Lekwungen people, need to harvest these plants often, and taking those plants away is not only harming the area but also preventing people from being able to harvest their cultural plants. If you have these plants, say, on your property, then I would suggest maybe growing growing the native plants or supporting their growth, and then ethically harvesting those plants and growing them to bolster the population. And if, say, you don't have a property, I don't have a property, um, and you want to grow native plants, there are a lot of great native plant nurseries that have followed the proper protocol to grow these plants, and now they grow their plants from the populations they have. Like Satin Flower Nursery is a great place, and that's where I get all of my native plants. I think I can go on to the next slide. Yeah, and so um, urban ecosystems kind of seems like a fallacy, but if you go downtown or you look outside, you'll notice that a lot of the space in a city is green and is growing and alive. And I really advocate that that shouldn't be overlooked. Obviously, you can look at it as most of the ecosystem has been destroyed by a bunch of plants or a bunch of uh, cities and cars and cement, but these places still act as corridors and safe havens for those species that are found inside of an urban ecosystem. So if you live in a place where you have a balcony, or you live somewhere near a local park, there's no feat is too small. You could grow one native plant, you could grow 1,000 native plants. They're all working towards the goal of restoring native ecosystems. So the plant on the right is actually a native onion, and you can see it's growing in a pot. So that's an easy thing you can do to grow on a balcony or in your backyard. And these plants and animals that are stuck in these large urban landscapes, they now have a place that they can provide habitat and reproduce and then spread across the landscape. And I think that's it from me. Let's go. Oh, wait, one more. Get involved. You can get involved in many ways. I work for Pagan Hayout Foundation, which we do a lot of our volunteer restoration days and would be happy to teach you about native plants and also removing native species. We do a lot of our work out at Sneedquith or Todd Inlet. There's also, which my colleague will talk to you a lot more about, the Sycam Ivy Project run by Sarah Jim, and Habitat Acquisition Trust is all around the lower Vancouver Island area. Before I forget, another way that you can get your hands on native plants to start growing a population of native plants is Habitat Acquisition Trust does plant salvage and plant saving. What would you say? Programs where you can sign up, and these are places that are going to be developed. And instead of waiting for the excavators to clear the space, people will go in before and they'll harvest those native plants and they'll grow them themselves to save those native plants for some other time. And then I think I'm done.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kyle. Such incredible work. And really interesting hearing about the different connections between species, like you were mentioning the butterfly and the ocean spray, and how like connected and dependent on each other they are. And I loved the peanut allergy. That must really resonate with kids well. Like they must really understand that when you share that. So
Mhm.
yeah, really neat. Um, I'm so excited to now pass it over to Sarah Jim, who's going to discuss invasive species removal. So I will just share the screen and pass it over to you, Sarah.
Hi, Chika. Ait tangin hela, helixin quins techol, gigis sin at nakwa, achang sin sa at the Sycam Ivy Project. So good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're all here and I'm grateful for you all for showing up. I'm going to be talking about the Sycam Ivy Project. And this is a project that I formed in 2021, and it is on an 18-acre property in Sycam, where I have ancestral roots to, and where I grew up and where I currently live. And it's, I say, I feel weird about saying it, but it's like Jim family land. So we have like the CP for this land. And I'm really grateful and honored to be able to steward this land in this way, because Sycam's a really small reservation. I think we have 100, 200 members, and most of the area it's by the airport in the northern tip on the Saanich Peninsula. And most of the area has been developed for housing, which is absolutely necessary, but this is one of the last remaining forests on the reserve and in the surrounding area, just because of all the development. And so I'm really just like proud and honored to be able to facilitate the Sycam Ivy Project to enhance the biodiversity and just create a place for accessible foods, medicines, and materials for my family and friends. Because like Kyle was saying, there's not a lot of places to harvest these days. So this is a way where I can live on the land in reciprocity. And I invite others to do so as well. We're a volunteer collective. Maybe we can go to the next slide. And I guess who am I and who is my family is kind of what this slide is about. So Sarah Jim Thanasnate, Chusalayat Sanat Sycam, Ailalang, Sequempton Thanamain, Wendy Thanatain. So my name is Sarah Jim. I'm from the Sycam village. My dad's name is Sequempton. That's his traditional name, or his English name is David Jim. That's him there in the slides. And we're of Coast Salish and Mexican ancestry. My mom's name is Wendy. We're of English and Russian Jewish ancestry. And I grew up in Sycam. Was like a bush kid. I went to the beach all the time. I'm the youngest of 5 girls. And just being on the land, I didn't really know much about it in terms of like native plants or pretty much anything. I saw like a wall of green a lot of the time. but as an adult, I actually got a job with Papekinheot, and this is where I learned a lot of the skills and knowledge that I have now, and I'm really grateful for that because it really helped me ground myself in this place, and it helped me differentiate what's native, what's invasive, and kind of steered my interest into this native plant world that I want to live in, that this realm of plants that I'm really interested in, really passionate about. And so I've known since I was a kid that this property area was like gym land. But I never really knew what I was looking at until a few years ago when I started really investigating what invasive species were and how detrimental they are to the land. And so yeah, me and my family just individually started to try to like take the ivy out, but because it's such a big swath of land, it seemed like insurmountable and impossible. And so in 2021, I started inviting volunteers and friends, and I had this kind of volunteer network of people from working at Papekinheot for 6 years. So I knew people were into doing this kind of work, and so I was kind of just had the audacity to be like, okay, we're starting this if you want to come. And luckily, people were showing up, and I started partnering with Habitat Acquisition Trust that Kyle mentioned, and Papekinheot also supports my project as well. And that was really nice of them for Hat to come on board because they were kind of taking on the admin tasks and like the administrative role of, organizing the volunteers and having contracts and stuff. And so I was really able to just focus on the work, and I just really appreciate that because I'm not a business person whatsoever. And yeah, I just wanted to mention too that Husaika means place of clay in Sinchothan, and that was the language that I was speaking in the beginning, and I'll probably speak throughout, along with being, I guess, a land steward. I'm an artist in the community. All of the plant art you saw in Kyle's presentation were mine. Thanks for the shout out, Kyle. And I'm currently taking a break from Papekinheot, but because I'm learning, I'm in full-time Indigenous language revitalization school at the Leonok tribal school that Kyle was talking about. And so right now my life is converging with plants, art, and language, and it's like really, really special and meaningful to be in the space that I'm in because it just creates so much more depth and understanding of the place that I'm in, but also the knowledge that I'm able to share with people who show up to do this work. Because I really am so appreciative of volunteers showing up that I really want to be generous with what I know as well. And it really just, like I said, creates a depth of place. And so we can go to the next slide. So this is what the forest was looking like a few years ago, and it was literally up to your knees in ivy everywhere. And you can see on this tree, there's like old growth ivy, like Jumanji vines climbing up this tree. And so with the help of Ian Bruce from Peninsula Streams, he's an old family friend, and was really passionate about invasive species removal. And he's always wanted to see this forest get attention and love. And so he was really excited to come on board and help me just start this work. And so he was teaching me that start with the trees, because it not only unstrangles the trees, but it mitigates, because when ivy grows up vertically, that's when it starts to produce fruit and goes to seed. And so it mitigates the spread of the ivy through seed, like birds and rodents eat the seeds and spread it elsewhere. And so that was a good starting point. We pretty much, if you go to the next slide, we pretty much de-vined the tree, the whole circumference, and then everything upwards eventually just dries up and falls off and dies, because it has no access to nutrients on the ground. And so that's where we started, and that probably took like an entire year. And we meet once a month, and every month around at the beginning it was like a dozen people or less would show up, but now we have numbers in like 30, 40 people, which is absolutely incredible. So we get a lot done, and it's really productive, and it's also just really fun to be out there in the bush, because doing restoration is kind of like being a kid again. You're like really close to the ground, you're discovering all these bugs and smells and just being in nature. And I feel like it's a really like sensory experience if you're able to do it. And also just working alongside like-minded people is really satisfying. And also like I love socializing, but I also love getting a task done. And so it's like the perfect activity for that. And if you go to the next slide. So we did the majority of the trees, like I said, and now we're starting to work on the ground, and we're hand pulling, and we're doing it by hand because there already is so much biodiversity in the forest that we want to be careful of the existing native plants. And so we're meticulously trying to like pull the ivy from the ground, and we're being careful to leave the snowberry, the trailing blackberry, the ocean spray, the nettle. There's just so much nice forest friends out here that we just want to be mindful of them. And we really go in with Eitchquelequins is what I like to promote. And Eitchquelequin is just having like a good heart and good feelings and a good mind. And working at Papakan Hayout, we had a lot of I guess volunteer groups, and a lot of them were kids who like gamify it, and they're like, oh, we'll just like kill all these brooms or kill all these blackberries, and kind of going in with like, I don't want to say hatred, but just like maybe like negative connotations. And so in my culture, just having Eitchquelekins when you do anything is really good, just because it makes the work, you're approaching it with love rather than like hatred. So, and it can be frustrating to go into a forest and see nothing but ivy, but it's really encouraging to go in with a group of people as a collective to do the same thing, because, you know, many hands make light work, and I guess just like misery loves company. But yeah, so Eitchquelequins is the way to go. And we're making really good headway with this hand pulling approach. I actually live in Sycam still, and I go back in the forest often to just kind of like check on the forest and check on the areas we've worked in. And I feel just really like, I don't know what the word would be, but just lighter, I guess. When I see in every spring, I see little baby native plants coming up. I see more trilliums coming up. I see June plums and like frogs and slugs, and there's bats. And it just makes me feel really, really good knowing that we as a community are making more space for the plants and the animals. So yeah, next slide, please. So every month, every time we meet, we start in circle, and everyone has the option and the invitation to introduce themselves. And the way that we do this is kind of just typical protocol of in community. Whenever you meet someone, they're like, who's your family? Because they really want to like place where you belong, I guess, or just like who you belong to. And so we invite people to share like where they're from or their ancestry and their pronouns. And sometimes we do like silly questions, like if you were a bird, what bird would you be? But mostly this is a practice of just like grounding ourselves before the work starts, and really just checking in with yourself before you go into it. And the ancestry thing is just kind of acknowledging like your relationality to the place and to the work and to each other. And it can make really good connections. Like there'd be two people from Ontario from the same small town, and they wouldn't have known if they didn't like introduce themselves in that way. So it is just nice to like open people up. And like I said, if they're wanting to, you definitely don't have to. Like, we want to be mindful of just people's vulnerabilities. And I've been starting to incorporate a Sinchothan word of the month. And that's really fun for me, just to share the language, but also just, like I said, to like ground ourselves in the place and really just, it's important to learn the language because it really, I guess, helps you understand the worldview of the culture of this place. You may or may not have heard that the language comes from the land. And I guess I'll give an example of this. I usually give the example of like wakis. And wakis means frog in Sinchothan. And instead of a frog saying ribbit, it says wakis. So it's like an onomatopoeia. And that's just a small example of how the land informs us of who it is and who it wants to be. Yeah, another example that Kyle mentioned was Sneedquith, and that means place of blue grouse. And Hussaikum, place of clay. So a lot of the language is indicators of what's happening on the land, or origin stories, or literal onomatopoeia. So it's just like a fun thing to share, the Sinchothan word of the month. And we also close in circle in this way, just to kind of close the work. And again, people are invited to reflect on the work, reflect on how they're feeling. And we've had a lot of like profound reflections in this time. And I'm really grateful for that because people feel safe enough to be that vulnerable. But yeah, it's just really, really nice to be able to listen to each other and share with each other and kind of bond in this way. So we'll go to the next slide. And these are just beautiful photos of what can be found in the forest. When I first started kind of surveying the land, I was seeing all these trilliums popping out of the ivy, like really struggling to get to the light. And just, it was kind of, it's really metaphorical, this work, because it's essentially like a visual representation of colonization and then like native species trying to just like make space for themselves. So yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again, like this is like a physical form of decolonizing in my eyes. And it's like one branch of land back. Because essentially we're continuing a long-standing tradition of land stewardship, which feels special to me because my ancestors have stewarded this land for time immemorial, and human intervention is really key to healthy ecosystems because when we take care of the land takes care of us. And an example of this would be like prescribed burning of camas meadows, Katha'alanuk. And this really added nutrients for the camas meadows to thrive. And it, I guess, produced more camas for the bees and the pollinators and everything. So yeah, human intervention is key. And that's another fallacy, like Kyle was talking about, of nature's here and people are over here and nature's gonna just like heal itself and do what it wants. But really, we need each other and we need to work in relation with one another. So yeah, the trilliums, now I'm seeing more and more pop up, and this is really special because it takes 7 years for a trillium to bloom, and they're blooming everywhere. So it just makes me happy to see these flowers kind of waited long enough to be able to just like be themselves, I guess. So yeah, I just wanted to show the slide mostly for the like beautiful nature aspect. So we can go to the next one. And here's a bunch of photos of volunteers and massive piles of ivy. Yeah, this activity is pretty straightforward. We're just pulling ivy out, piling it up, and disposing of it as responsibly as we can. And it's literal tons and tons of ivy. It's insane, just the amount of work that's being done here. And I'll just be forever grateful for the people that show up. And we have repeat volunteers that show up like monthly. And that's really cool to me because they're starting to be friends with each other. And there's like this community that's growing. And so restoration is really, it's really healing work. And it's not just healing the land, but it's like healing connections with people and connections with place and like connections with yourself. Because sometimes I find myself not, well, I say not being able, but I don't prioritize going outside sometimes. And this really forces me to kind of slow down and be present and do something that's bigger than me with a group of people. And so if you're able to, like, I would recommend definitely getting out and joining an organization that does like restoration volunteer opportunities. And if you're not able to go out, donating to nonprofits like Popek and Hangout and Hat are really, really helpful. Because we live in a world where, you know, the government's not taking full force on this issue. And so it's kind of up to the little guys to do something about it. But once you're in this world, you realize there's so many people out there that want to help, and it's really encouraging. And it's really also empowering because in this world of chaos and unknowingness, it's for me, this work really helps me to like gain my autonomy back and my empowerment back because it teaches me that I can do something. And yeah, it's constant practice as well. Like restoration is relationships. You have to keep constantly working on it. You have to keep going back. You have to keep tending to the land. It's not like horticultural landscaping where you go in, install it, and then leave and never touch the thing again. Like you have to constantly build a relationship with this place. And it's kind of like any other relationship in your life, like your partner or your friends or yourself. You have to just like keep checking in and keep asking if they're okay, you know, and um, just keep giving it love, and you'll definitely see the benefits of like it starts to give you love back. And yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say. All those photos, 98% of those photos were taken by Carissa Chandrakate, and there's her website there. She comes and takes photos of most of the ivy poles, and it's really cool to just capture those moments of like joy and contemplation and just the beautiful biodiversity that's starting to benefit from this work. There's my website and on Instagram. But yeah, if you want to reach out and you want to volunteer, you can go to my website and just ask to be added to the mailing list. And yeah, I think my ending note would just be to put yourself out there. Like that's how I met Kyle, was through this work, and that's how I've met a lot of really good friends and really cool like-minded people. So it does really help my mental health as well, just being around a group of people who are like super awesome and trying to do good in the world, because it's so easy to get just sad about things. So, and the plants are just beautiful. And sometimes you see a frog and it's like the best day of your life. And then, yeah, it's just really, really fun. So I guess that's where I'll stop it. But Hajka for listening. Hajka at the Lalaitnang. Jijasan Tia Enoch. So yeah, I'm happy to answer questions if you have them, or compliments if you have them. Hajka.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such a beautiful presentation and really stunning photos as well. We are going to move into some questions. We have some questions from folks who are attending tonight. And so I'm just going to pull those up. So first question we have for both of you is there a concern about invasive animals or just plants? There are invasive grazing animals on several islands that cause considerable changes in the flora and are certainly invasive. Are there any regional policies or practices or concerns? Floor is open to either of you.
Um, yes,
Okay.
there are many invasive animals. The invasive animals is it's kind of a harder deal because it's more of a philosophical conundrum of like this is more visually a living thing than maybe a plant is. Our Sarah and I don't necessarily work with removing invasive animals. However, we do know of some. On the lower island, the European wall lizard, I'm sure many of you have seen, is an invasive animal, and it kills a lot of the native bugs and even frogs and stuff like that. And so that's harming at a different trophic level than maybe the plants are, but it's still quite harmful and quite destructive. And there's a big example around us is there's a lot of fallow deer on Skathaman or Sydney Island. And so Parks Canada is working hard to deal with managing those deer. And so I think the current strategy for managing those deer is they've hired hunters to go and uh, lower the population or remove the population from the island because those deer are basically killing every single plant that sprouts from the ground. And so slowly that entire island would cease to exist in a natural state. So there are invasive animals, but they require a lot more of a philosophical and regulational lens than more of the invasive plants.
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't work with animals in that way, but I fully support it just because it's kind of for the good of all. Like around us, we have the toads, bullfrogs, and they were brought over for food, I guess. And then they just exploded in population and they eat literally everything, like little salmon fry, frogs, like little birds, they eat each other. Like they're really detrimental for the native like equilibrium. And so Sandown up the road from me is actually hiring people to kind of like try to eradicate them, but it is really hard just because they're constantly, it's like invasive plants, like they're really good at surviving and they're really good at reproducing. But I like as much of it is to feel sad for these animals, like it is good, it is for the better, for the greater good. Like with the deer on Skathaman or even Skathak or Sadeas, like pretty much all the Gulf Islands have problems with fallow deer. They like mostly islanders complain about them eating their garden, but really they're like decimating camas meadows and like essentially on Skathaman, it's a fern desert is what they're calling it. So everything up to where the deer can reach is bare ground. And for a long time, it'd be silent on that island. Like there would be no birds because there would be no nesting sites for them. And so it is as much as it is hard to kind of cope with like the death of these animals, they do provide food for the hunters and they are providing food for the nation. And the absence of them really helps the native ecosystem like have a chance. And it is within our like Saanich laws that the deer need to be hunted. Like we have a story of the Smythe being the hunted one that I won't get into, but it's built within our laws here that they have to be hunted. And so I get the perspective of like PETA and like vegetarians and things, but really it's really short-sighted to save these deer that aren't even from here for what? So they can be overpopulated and get sick. Like no, it doesn't work that way. So Sorry, dear people, but it's my hot take on that. Like, we need to have intervention just like we need to have intervention with the plants. So, yeah, Nithal, that's it. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both for those really insightful thoughts. We have many questions now, actually. Another question, what is the First Nation name for blue grouse or Todd Inlet?
The name for the grouse is Nead, and the name for Sneedquith is Sneedquith. So it's essentially like the place of blue grouse, and I just learned that the queth suffix means by canoe, like go by canoe. So traditionally you'd go through Chothlup to Sneedquith by water. So Sneedquith.
Beautiful. Another question for you, Sarah. Someone wants to know, what is your word of the month for January?
We haven't been meeting because it's December and I'm a baby now that I'm in school, so I'm like an indoor cat. But maybe let me think about it until the next question and then I'll let you know.
Okay. We had a lot of similar questions, so we're going to share this one. So if you don't hear your question, it's probably because it was similar to this one. So the question is, some of us are launching a no ivy league on Salt Spring Island to unfriend ivy in Muat Park. The issue is disposal. It's horrendously expensive to take it to the sanitation site. People want to know, Sarah, how are you dealing with the ivy?
Yeah, I'm currently in conversations with CRD to kind of find the perfect solution, but there's no standardization for disposing of invasive species responsibly. So at first I was getting a truck to haul it up island to a mill that was burning it for biofuel. But even then, I never got a straight answer if that's what they were actually doing. And so, and then I was taking it to the green waste here. And they said they like solarize it until all the seeds and all the roots are absolutely like burned and dead. But then the CRD was like, they don't do that. And I was like, well, then what is happening? So I don't have an answer yet, but I'm trying to avoid just taking it to the dump like most people do. So if anyone has an answer to that, then I would love to hear it because I have a lot of ivy. Some people actually come and take it for like basket weaving and stuff. So there are like creative uses, but there's just so much biomass that it's not like practical to have a million baskets, I guess.
Yeah,
Sorry, I don't have a good answer to that.
that makes sense. So as a follow-up, if you brought the ivy to a disposal center, do you have an estimate of total weight so far?
I'm not that organized, unfortunately. Last the last trip we took, it was like maybe 6 months of work. It was like 4 tons. So, and that was in the summer without it being all wet. So this is why I need hat because they can like track stuff like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Another question about the ivy. So does the ivy come back, or is the removal quite permanent in the areas you have cleared?
It like it's weird to say that ivy is one of the better invasive species because once you do pull it, it usually stays away. I think what I'm seeing growing back are little fragments that people have missed and seeds that have been in the ground that are sprouting now that they have space to do so. But really, it stays away. Like eventually, we're doing one massive sweep to kind of uncover the land, and then we'll go back and get all the little plants that are sprouting up. So yeah, you do have to go back and do that, but for now, we're just trying to get the bulk of it.
Yeah, that's great. So another question for both of you. Can you offer a list of the invasives most needing to be removed?
Yeah. Definitely depends like where you are. There's a lot of good information on like local municipality websites. Where Sarah works, obviously it's Ivy. Where I work at Sneedquith, I found it's mainly blackberries and Daphne. But the ones that I've seen most prevalent across like restoration sites have been ivy and Scotch broom and gorse, just because of the two latter ones, just because of the difficulty of removal and like sustained removal is really difficult. The gorse is very prickly, and the Scotch broom is quite adept at staying in the soil for a long time, and their seeds are viable for like 10 years. So it requires like long term care and management. Um, for the animals, I know that the bullfrog is a very pervasive invasive species, and also the zebra mussels in the Okanagan. And that's just because they're so easily transported through people's recreation.
As a follow-up to that, you mentioned so easily transported through people's recreation. Is there anything that people can do to help prevent that?
Yeah, yeah. A major way that invasive species are spread once they've established in a place is through humans. Just like you go on a walk with your dog, and your dog brushes through a bunch of invasive seeds, and then you go to another park or you go down the road. Same with I mentioned like the zebra mussels. They attach themselves to boats, and so when people transport their boats to different lakes or different recreation sites, that's how they spread. And so the best way to prevent spread of invasive species is to be mindful of that, and just what a lot of what we do at our restoration projects and just personally is to, whenever we're leaving a site that we know has invasive species, just to check your clothes and any materials that you've brought if they're dirty, and maybe scrub them off. Or in my car I have like a brush just to brush my boots or brush my clothes that got dirty, that can hold those seeds. And like Sarah was saying, like the seeds of the ivy and the seeds of many other things, when you're doing invasive removal, they exist for a long time. So like that plant material has to be disposed of properly, which sadly it's mainly the landfill for most places. Because if you say put that in your compost bin, then those seeds are going to stay viable, and when that compost is distributed to people around the city, that those seeds will then grow again.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for those helpful tips. Someone asked, is there a volunteer group of the type Kyle mentioned on Gabriela Island? And we did have an answer from trustee Susan Yates. Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for attending tonight. She says there is a very active invasive species committee as part of GALT on Gabriela, so you can contact GALT on their website. That's the Gabriela Island Land and Trails Trust. So thank you so much for that response, Susan, and for the individual who asked that question. Another question, for Sarah, are you dealing with other invasives or mostly ivy on your land?
I'd say 90% is ivy, and then there are a little like spurts of Himalayan blackberry that are pretty old that we'll need to deal with. There's sporadic holly around, and then there's like sporadic Daphne that we've found. And then more towards where the paths are and where there's been human human like what am I looking for? Where humans have been, like trails and stuff. There's like thistle and the really spiky one with the ball on the top. What's that one, Kyle?
Diesel?
Yeah, teasel. And there's like random little herbaceous ones, but ivy is the majority of it, which is kind of good, like I said, because it's like a better one because it's somewhat easier to get rid of. And just while I'm at it, I think my word of the month will be sawtouch, and that's the northeast wind, and that brings freezing weather. All the winds bring something different. So sawtouch.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right, another question about ivy and ivy pulling. So someone shares, on Hornby, we are about to host a big ivy pulling event. I'm wondering if you think it's okay to burn the ivy.
I've heard different things about that. I've heard that apparently it's toxic, like the smoke is toxic, and so that's why I've been kind of staying away from doing that. Other people burn it. It might be fine to burn if you're not like roasting marshmallows on it or like just being anywhere near it. But if anyone else has thoughts or ideas about that, I'd love to hear them because it would be an effective way to get rid of it.
Yeah, great. Someone else asks, what's the most effective way to remove English holly so it won't regrow?
What we've found at Bacon Hayout is the best way is to dig out as much of the roots as possible. If you find like a big tree and you cut it down, I'm sure you've noticed that a bunch of small hollies will sprout up. And in a sense, that's effective. You've prevented that large holly from making a lot of seeds that will be spread. It just means that that'll be more of a time commitment because you'll you'll remove it and then you'll have to keep managing those sprouts so that they don't photosynthesize so that the roots run out of photosynthetic material to survive and then those roots will decay. I don't know the exact timeline of how long it would take for those roots to decay, but that's often what we do with blackberries as well, is we'll cut them down to the ground and then as they sprout up, we will take a sweep of our restoration sites and cut them so that they are no longer able to photosynthesize. But the best way is to get the entire roots out because then you don't have to wait for that to happen.
Got it. Okay. Another question about invasive species removal. Do either of you have experience with burr chervil removal and whether we can ever get rid of it?
No, sorry.
I think Fort Rod Hill is maybe dealing with that. So they would be a good, like Parks Canada at Fort Rod Hill might be good people to reach out to for that. I think they were like tiger torching it, but reach out to them and ask.
Awesome. Someone else asks, connected to roots and invasive species, so are there ways to destroy the roots without harming everything else? And just how do you get it all? How do you get it all? Yeah.
Yeah, there's people are trying a lot of different strategies. There's for the Scotch broom and the Daphne, if you're unable to get out the roots, people have been cutting the stems and then peeling back the bark, which exposes the plant to rot and to disease, and then those roots will die. Apparently, that's been relatively effective. Removing the roots is sort of like win and loss because like you are pulling it out, but it is often disturbing the soil and then allowing for other invasive plants to grow. But yeah, removing you can't really eliminate the roots without digging out the roots just because that's like where they live is in the ground.
So Another question, have you got any advice for organizing community efforts to remove invasive Daphne, which is toxic?
Yes, well, I say we still, as if I'm working with Papignat still, but like me and Kyle have both worked with Daphne on Sedaeus on Quananooch, the resland out there. And we work with kids too, so we're extra careful. So we have them wear gloves and wash their hands after. And sometimes if they want to wear glasses, they can. So just taking those precautions of trying not to get the sap on your skin, like long sleeves, long pants and stuff. Because it's phototoxic, and then when it interacts with UV and it's on your skin, it starts to like burn and itch. And we've never seen or witnessed that happen before, but we just take all those precautions anyway. Do you have anything to add, Kyle?
Yeah. Especially with Daphne, just because of it being toxic. I worked a lot with Daphne, and the toxicity, yeah, comes from the sap. So when we have the students digging it out, we're either having them dig out the entire plant and root, or we're having them pull it out manually if they're small enough. We don't necessarily do any cutting on the Daphne just because that's where it would expose you to the sap more so than pulling out just the roots. Um, and yeah, because when you also cut it, then the sap goes in the air and it can often cause you to have a sore throat, which I've noticed. But Daphne is known as allelopathic, which means it like sends out chemicals into the soil to prevent other plants from growing. So we found that digging out the roots of Daphne is not as harmful because those other native plants that would exist with, say there was another invasive species, have been prevented from growing because of this Daphne and these Daphne roots. So we're more confidently able to go into the ground and dig out the entire roots, knowing we're not going to harm any plants that exist there because they'll have to reestablish after those plants are gone.
And Daphne's pretty somewhat easy to take out because it mostly just has one tap root. So you can kind of pull it out pretty easy depending on how big it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, are either of you familiar with periwinkle? Someone says, I have a huge infestation and I have been hand picking it, which seems to work, but this takes years and years.
Yeah, so it's a ground cover, so it's really effective at doing its job. And yeah, it's just it's just frustrating. These plants were brought over purposefully for that purpose, and now we have to deal with trying to get them out. But it's really good that you're starting. When I was working in Sneedquist, we would do it by hand as well, but I don't know if Kyle has any more effective ways.
Yeah, I would say by hand or with hand trowels. And then another way to help manage that is you could try to grow some native shrubs in that area to take up that space and take up those nutrients so that the plant can't grow back as easily.
Yeah, snowberry grows really fast if you're looking to fill a space. And it's the bumblebee's second favorite flower to visit, next to camas.
Is camas the bumblebee's first favorite flower?
Yeah, great camas and common camas are 1 and 2. And then there's snowberry is I guess, third.
Mhm.
And it's so cute watching a bumblebee visit a snowberry flower. I'm pretty sure they do buzz pollination. So they like flap their wings in a special way to like release the pollen, and then they get up all in there. Yeah, it's cute. And that's another thing. Often I get asked about like what's it called? Ethnobotany, like how people use plants. And I've stopped doing plant walks just because I was getting a little bit frustrated with the one-sided nature of it, like me just kind of like giving all my knowledge to people who kind of just received it And so restoration is a really good way to gain this knowledge because there's that like reciprocal relationship. But often I was getting questions of like, oh, this is snowberry and it's like the bumblebee's favorite. And people would be like, well, what does it do for humans? What can it do for me? And though that question really frustrated me because it's a very anthropocentric view of these plants, like it's not there to serve you. And so I was kind of invited people to shift their mentality to be like, instead of thinking, what can it do for me? Maybe let's think of like, what can I do for it or them? So Snowberry brings up, I guess, something in me that reminded me about that situation because I love planting it, and I know Kyle loves Snowberry as well, pup kiosks. Um, and it does, you can't eat it, it's poisonous, like, but the birds like it, so that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I've yet to see this plant. I will have to Google what it looks like and then go and find it at some point.
Once
Um,
you know it, you will see it literally everywhere.
yeah, that's how I felt after I learned camas, and then yeah, because I'm originally from Ontario, and then once I saw it, I was like, oh, I'll see it. I see it everywhere now when it's in bloom. All right, someone else asks, when the soil is disturbed by the root pulling, is it helpful to have some native seeds to plant in the disturbed soil?
I would say always helpful to have native seeds. And yeah, if the soil's disturbed, it's easier for the native seeds to establish, especially when you have like grasses around. Grasses are so good at making it mat that those native seeds can't get to the soil. So once you've pulled out and it's all nice and aerated, the native seeds love to take up that space.
Beautiful. Going back to snowberry for a second, someone asks, how do you propagate snowberry?
That might be Kyle's favorite question.
Awesome.
I'm practicing propagating snowberry. Snowberry is actually an interesting one because the seeds they take, I think they need a 180-day dormancy, and that includes like 100 days of cold and then 80 days of warm. So you're basically planting a seed and waiting almost a year because that's the seasons don't totally line up, cold and then really warm. So you're basically waiting a year to see if that seed even grows. And so I'm in the process of trying that part, but you can propagate them quite easily doing cuttings. Now, cuttings, they don't promote as much genetic diversity, but say you put a bunch of cuttings out into the world and then they get pollinated, that still promotes diversity. So I found cuttings is the best way to do it. There's a lot of YouTube videos on how to do cuttings of, I think it's a soft wood, but yeah, just do cuttings. Basically, you trim off a part of the stem and then you just stick it in the ground or in some soil, and you'll notice that I would usually do it in the fall just because that's when the leaves are going to fall off anyways. So then the plant puts all of its nutrients into its stem and roots. So it's less taxing on the plant when it's in the fall and winter. So I would do the cuttings in the fall and winter. And then you'll notice in the spring, they'll start to make their seeds, and even sometimes they'll make the flowers and berries in that single year.
Patience is key, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Another question. Are there people we can contact to remove yellow flag iris? And do we need a permit for removal?
Depending on where you live, I would reach out to Habitat Acquisition Trust. They have a dedicated team that visits properties and parks doing restoration. And they even partner with people on private land to help them remove invasive plants. So I would reach out to them. There's also a couple, it depends if it's on public or private property, but there's also a couple native plant landscaping businesses out there. One of them is called Co-Evolve Landscaping. I can't remember the other ones, but I'm sure a quick Google would be able to help you out. But Habitat Acquisition Trust would be a good place to start.
Amazing. Lots of rep for HAT tonight. HAT is such an incredible organization.
They're the best.
Yeah. All right, another question for both of you. How concerned are you about shiny pink geranium?
I haven't run into it yet, and I'm grateful for that because there's enough to worry about. But I don't know. What about you, Kyle?
I've heard horror stories of how fast it is and how quick it is at spreading. I know Sanish municipality is taking, I think they're putting shiny geranium at one of their highest priorities of prevention. I'm hopeful that it will be managed. I haven't also had to deal with it out where we do our restoration, luckily, but yeah, if I ever did notice an established spot of shiny geranium, I've heard stories, so I know that that would be our number one priority to remove as well.
Yeah. Another question, our final question, actually, that we have right now. Have either of you run into issues with a fennel? It seems to be everywhere lately, especially along the Songhees walkway.
And yeah, I haven't noticed it be as invasive as say the other plants we've talked about, but I have seen that large fennel patch in Songhees, and it's yeah, I don't know if it will be difficult to remove but it doesn't seem like it's spreading that fast. So I'm sure a dedicated team could deal with it. Yeah, it's not one that you really want to like eat either, just because it's in a space that's got a lot of urbanization and it probably ha uptakes a lot of things that you don't want to eat.
Yeah, I'm just in my ivy microcosm over here, so I haven't run into that yet. Hopefully not yet. Like, I haven't run into it.
One plant is enough to deal with right now.
One thing at a time.
One thing at a time. All right, so we have about 10 minutes still. If anyone has any further questions that they want to ask, please leave them in the Q&A section, and we will ask those. I am just going to take a couple minutes here to share a few comments that we received from folks tonight. So someone shares that I have offloaded a lot of ivy to goat keepers. And the No Ivy League in Portland, Oregon chops the ivy up into small pieces and leaves it in a pile in the forest. They say that that it is eventually used as mulch. So someone wanted to share that. Someone else shares regarding Daphne removal. We are very careful about using gloves, bagging the plant, and being very sure to cut the large ones below the ground. Someone on Gambier shares I put blackberry canes through my chipper slash shredder and then composted in the long pile enough to be sure there's no living green material. Would that work with ivy potentially?
Yeah, I'm like still really learning as I go. But I know that there is potential, like the way that we remove it from the forest is we pull it up and we take it out of the forest and like pile it up, because I've heard that if you leave fragments of the plant on the ground, it has the potential to reroot. And so I don't know how effective it is at re-sprouting from tiny little bits of itself. So it would be a good experiment to conduct, but I'm not sure.
Great. Someone else on Hornby shares that they were cutting large Daphne just under the ground and then squirting a bit of VSS vinegar soap salt solution on the cut. With large holly, we debranch, debury, and cut the trunks high while girdling the trunk close to the ground. This has been pretty effective. If leaves spout at the top, you can cut another few inches off each year for quite a while. Good tips there. Someone else visited Oregon last year and they saw an entire Oregon white oak ecosystem engulfed by shiny geranium, which is why it is incredibly important to report any sightings here. Yeah, wow. Someone else shares, I bought a polar bear, yes, a tool for prying out holly, which is pretty hard to dig out. Neat, a polar bear. I'll have to see, it sounds like polar bear. And someone else shares here, all bird species, even owls, suffer from lack of shrubs and undergrowth in the forest. There's nothing left for them to nest, rest, and eat in. Even owls need shrubs to protect their fledglings as they move back and forth from their tree nests to break their falls, give them ladders, and protect them from predators. Very beautiful. Yes. Someone else shares about the Invasive Species Council of BC, has a lot of information on invasive species, so plant and animals, including priorities, techniques, and links to more information. So that would be a good place for folks to go to learn, to have more resources and learn more. And we have a weekly volunteer opportunity here. So in Victoria, so there's a weekly volunteer opportunity at Government House Woodlands in Victoria. For blackberry, ivy, broom, and daphne removal, which continue to be issues after 30 years of continuous control efforts. Wow. Yeah, so it just shows how tough these invasive species are, how long they stick around for, and also why these restoration efforts are so important. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Thank you so much to all of our attendees for all of the amazing questions and for attending tonight. I also want to give a special thanks to Sarah and Kyle for your incredible presentations and insightful thoughts. We really appreciate you both sharing your time and expertise with us. So we encourage all of the attendees to please join us for our Living with Fire webinar on February 28th, where we will learn about the current state of forest health and the interconnections between healthy watersheds, native biodiversity, and fire resilience in Howe Sound and the northern region of the Trust area. We will also discover actionable steps for building resilience in communities, including more information about the traditional practice of controlled fires that help reduce fuel for wildfires and wetland restoration to create a more fire resilient future. Our speakers will be Jill Christ from the Salish Fire Keepers Society and Connor Corbett from Frontera Forest Solutions. So more information and registration links are on our website under Stewardship Education. Thank you so much, everybody, again for attending. Thank you again to Sarah and Kyle, and have a good evening. We'll see you at our next webinar.
Hi, Ska.
Bye, everyone.
Ashka.